welcome to this week's edition of the Maine Challenge. Last week we did a live video on Facebook, and this week we're presenting that to you in our traditional format. We are talking about work. You know, the thing where we spend most of our time, and we spend a lot of our time thinking about it. Because during the pandemic and since in this economy, lots is changing about work. So we get to talk with some amazing people. First, Susan Feiner of the University of Southern Maine, who was a professor there of economics and women's studies for 25 years. And then with Andy O'Brien, who was with the AFL-CIO and is a labor historian and is an amazing wealth of knowledge about what's happening. And we talk about what's happening in the shift in the balance of power between employers and workers. For decades, it's been an employer's market. And maybe, just maybe, this is the shift to a worker market. So we'll see, tune in, and thanks for joining us. Welcome, and we are so grateful to have you here on this episode of the Maine Challenge. As you might have seen through some of our testing promos this week, we are doing something different in Maine Challenge today. We are going live on Facebook, and then it will be on our YouTube channel as always. If you are not a subscriber or not watching this on the Maine Facebook Challenge page or on the Betsy Sweet Me page, then you can't participate in the conversation. And we want you to participate. We want you to send in your comments, your questions. So please, if you are not on either of those pages, go to one of those if you want to participate. If you're just watching, sit back and relax because we have a great show for you. Today, we're talking about something that all of us deal with, which is work. And the pandemic and the economy and maybe a perfect storm of those two things coming together, we are in a situation where we have, you see wanted, people wanting help everywhere. We see people saying $18 an hour, hire us, move people. We see some wages going up. We see employers saying they don't have enough workers. We see things shutting down. I got a notice yesterday from my physician that my appointment that was scheduled for tomorrow is going to be changed because they're only open 3 days a week now due to staffing shortages. We see restaurants and stores that are not open at full time because we sort of gotten used to having everything at our disposal whenever we want it, which is a whole other thing we can talk about. But anyway, so we see our unemployment rate in Maine is below 5%. And yet we still say we have, it's going to be a really interesting time. And as we see this new variant of the Omicron variant, who knows what that's going to do? I think most of us thought most economists thought we'd be out of this by now. So there's lots of things going on. So we have lots of folks who are going to be with us tonight, starting with my friend Susan Feiner, who is a former professor of economics and women's studies at USM for 25 years. She published a lot as a professor there. She's also known affectionately as the Rogue Professor. And so, Susan, thank you so much for being with us. We are really, really, we're so happy to see you. So it's great to see you. Yeah, awesome. So we have this crazy thing. We have a worker shortage, allegedly a worker shortage. We have people saying, I think the pandemic provided so many workers with a pause in their life. We all have those pauses where we say, am I doing the right thing? But the pandemic was sort of a forced pause, I think, for so many people to say, is this what I want to be doing? Do I want to go back to this job? What kind of job am I in? We have essential workers that we talk about as being essential, but we don't treat them as being essential. So I'm just wondering, as an economist, as you look at this and has been looking at it for years, what's your take on what's going on?
Well, first, I want to be sure that the audience understands that what is happening in the labor markets today is the best thing that has happened for American workers since the 1990s. So this is not a problem for workers. This is a problem for bosses who have for too long been able to stay in business because they pay below living wages. So that these corporations have, if I was at an economics conference, I would say super profits that have not been allowed to be, that have not been competed, that have not been reduced by the wage level rising. You see, when you're looking at macroeconomic health, tight labor markets is the best sign you can have, because the people who are working in your economy, that means that they have jobs, that they have job mobility because there's a general demand for workers. And it also means that it's better for workers' unions because of those conditions. And so it enables workers as a group to get more control of their lives. And I think what the pandemic did was allow people to see how much their lives could change if they had more control and autonomy vis-a-vis work. And so when you talk about a lot of people quitting their jobs, Betsy, last number I saw was 12.7 million people.
Yeah.
That's got to be 10% of the labor force.
Yeah.
Now, this 10% of the labor force did not just, throw their clothes away and live in a closet in the dark growing mushrooms or weed or something.
Yeah.
They've got to be doing something to feed themselves and their families and pay their rent. So looking into that further, we see lots and lots of about a 15% increase year over year in the number of self-employment requests for self-employment ID cards from Social Security.
Uh-huh.
So we know a lot of people are trying to go into work for themselves.
Right.
That's a mixed bag, because working for yourself, you obviously have no labor protections.
Right.
Right? You work for yourself. You're likely to be hyper exploited. But for the workforce that's out there working for a wage in a worker-employee relationship, these tight labor markets are wonderful news.
Yeah.
And the best policy building on this is to raise the standards of labor, particularly in the public sector, so that the workers who are available are attracted to the public sector to be doing work in the public interest.
Okay.
Because that's the work that needs to be done now.
Right.
Since the 1980s, we've seen work and growth and expansion in the private interest. And look where it's gotten us. It's gotten us into existential crisis of survival vis-a-vis the climate. Let me stop for 1 second here. I started out by saying the labor shortage is not a problem for labor. It's a good thing. I was flummoxed the other day when our president, who is trying to marshal forces to respond to the climate crisis, released 50 million barrels of gas. We need the price of gas to go up. That has to happen if we're going to transition out of fossil fuels. So we need to build public mechanisms for that to go on.
Well, and I think that's one of the things that's happening is these things that are seemingly contradictory are happening at the same time. And I think that is, fossil fuel is one example. And I think what I hear you talking about is really that shift in power. We're starting to see a shift in the balance of power. For decades, the power has been in the hands of employers who have had successful business models based on paying people a wage that's not a livable wage. And so now we're starting to see that shift a little bit. But I also think that we've got to look at, and I know you're the perfect person to talk about this, so many of the people, as I look at the statistics and what's happening in the labor market, so many of the people who quit or had to leave their jobs during the labor market were women. Women who
That's exactly right.
could not
So this is
childcare, who had to do caregiving and couldn't do it. And I just read a statistic today that globally, I think $8 billion was lost by women workers during the pandemic. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Since that's the first I've heard of the statistic, I'm a little confused by the number because I'm used to thinking of women's work as a percentage of global work, not as a dollar bill.
I don't care about the amount, but I'm just saying, let's talk about what has happened to women workers.
Well, right, because to policymakers, eliminating on-site childcare looks like it, quote, saves money. But if down the road, more people quit their jobs and more people take more absenteeism, then actually eliminating your childcare facility raises your costs. Mm-hmm. It's the difference between a bookkeeping costs that you write a check for, as compared to a larger notion of cost in terms of your whole labor force, and how often do you have to hire people and train them? Because hiring and training employees is a huge cost for U.S. employers, partly because, again, shrinking of the public support for people moving into the workforce, like apprenticeship programs. So the disappearance of childcare, well, those workers were very underpaid workers. So of course, when it becomes impossible, they have to take care of their kids. So the more corporate mom can't leave her kids with the lower income person. And then the whole office over here is out of whack because it doesn't have enough people to do the job. So yes, we're creating these really difficult tensions in the economy.
Well, I just saw a thing that 25,000 women in Maine left the workforce during the pandemic due to lack of childcare. So 25,000, and as you said, it's not just the lack of childcare, it's the people who are providing the childcare. They have to stay home with their kids. And then with schools shutting down, even now, it's like, well, what do you do if your second grader, right? You have to work and your second grader
has to stay home because there was COVID in the classroom.
Exactly. So Susan, as you look at it, when you see all these, this is for your final thing, when you see all these help wanted signs and, what is your thought about that? What's your sort of visceral economist reaction when you see that?
Well, as a person who came to Maine pretty late in my life, I was in my 40s. One of the things I love about Maine is the natural beauty. And when I drive down the road and I see help wanted, I'm desperate, help wanted, and it's attached to some fast food store or a place selling tires, I'm delighted, because that's telling me that these businesses cannot thrive and flourish at wages that provide a decent standard of living. So we're going to see a transition, not just in what's available in the stores, but what people actually want to purchase. Yeah, wages are going up. People want more leisure. And when you have more leisure, it's much easier to go take a hike.
Yes.
When you're working two jobs, your leisure is go to the mall, because you can do that in 30 minutes.
Yeah. Right.
So it really, I believe that if workers can capitalize on the tightness in current labor markets, and if politicians will support workers and take advantage of some of the good rulings that have come from the National Labor Review Board under Biden, I think it's possible that we could start to see a significant shift in power away from, at least more power on the part of workers to demand and receive more dignity and better pay at work.
Well, that's a positive thing, and maybe that's the silver lining of the pandemic. Susan, thank you so much for being with us. It's Susan Feiner again, former professor at USM. It is great to have you, and thanks for all your excellent work. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Betsy. This was a delight. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks, Susan. Now we have Andy O'Brien, and I'm going to admit him in now. He's coming in. And Andy is an incredible, he is a writer and a researcher, and he is a communications guy for the AFL-CIO, and he is a labor expert. And Andy, I'm welcoming you back to Maine Challenge. Andy was one of our guests earlier when we were talking about right-wing white supremacist groups, but this is a different story. And so it's great to have you. Thanks for joining us. And Andy, I don't know, you probably couldn't hear it, but Susan and I were just talking about the pandemic and this worker shortage, which I think maybe is a failure to pay a decent wage shortage, but how that's shifting the balance of power between employers and employees. And we've seen some incredible success, and I think maybe I'm just more attuned to it, but strikes like the John Deere strike and workers saying, hey, we've got the power now. Now's our time to actually get some working conditions that provide us with some dignity. You want to talk about that? Do you agree? Do you see that that's what's happening?
Yeah, and I would say that one of my frustrations with the mainstream media over the past year in reporting on this so-called Great Resignation is that they always focus on the fact that certain employers can't find workers, and not on the fact that this is a tight labor market, and that's good news for working people because they have more leverage in this economy. And so, we ran an unemployment assistance group since the beginning of the pandemic. So we've counseled a lot of people who are getting back into the workplace. And time again, we heard from people who worked in a lot of low-wage occupations, from hospitality and the restaurant industry, that they were just fed up with the way that they were being treated, the horrible schedules, the low wages, lack of benefits, and they're looking for something else. At the same time, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so you have a lot of people who are retiring or just not going back to work because they're worried, rightfully so, about contracting COVID because they're in high risk categories. And as for the labor movement, we've seen this massive strike wave, Striketober, as it was called in the media, or Strikesgiving, actually, for this month. And workers from, like you said, John Deere, Kellogg's, nurses across Kaiser Permanente, just all over the country, and we've got others brewing in Maine, are just saying, look, we've had to put up with stagnant wages, with two-tier systems that were put in place in the 80s that are meant to divide different classes of workers, and lousy benefits, and we're tired of it. And, we deserve to be treated fairly and deserve to get a living wage. I was looking at a recent report today that corporate profits in the U.S. Are the highest that they've been since 1950. Wow. And so, corporations are making bank right now, no matter what they tell you about things like inflation or whatever. They're doing very well. And a tight labor market is good for working people because they have more leverage to collectively bargain for a more fair share of the wealth they create.
Yeah. Well, and also I think I'm curious. I've read those statistics too about how much a profit, the incredible profits that are being made by corporations. And I think one of the things that we're seeing, in addition to wages, people are looking for flexibility. They are looking for, and they have some leisure time. And I think with the internet and social media and that stuff, it's easier to find a job that's going to, like I had some young people I was talking to, and they said, if we can't have flexibility in our jobs, we're not taking it. We're not going to do it. And so I think it's wages as well as working conditions, I think, is another piece of it. But I want to talk with you, first of all, it's to encourage, if you're watching and you have questions or a comment or an experience, please just put it in the chat and we will get to it. So, but Andy, I wanted to ask, you had sent me an article about how, all these, people say, I can't believe no one's getting these jobs. They're $18 an hour. And in fact, there's a little bait and switch going on, right?
Yes. Yeah. And this has been something that's been very frustrating for me as we counsel people who are re-entering the workplace, is you see these signs that say, hiring at McDonald's, $18 an hour, we're hiring at Shaw's starting at $16 an hour. Now, you should pay attention to the asterisks on those signs if they have them, because what we're finding is that people are taking these jobs thinking that they're going to be paid a certain amount and then finding out that it's a total bait and switch. So, for instance, a woman told me just the other day that one of her kids tried to apply for a job at Shaw's, and they said hiring all departments, 15 for part-time, 16 for full-time. Well, I went and applied for the job, and it turns out that was only for deli. And there's other situations where people have said that they applied for a job that was $16 an hour, but then it turned out the job was actually $12.50. 16 was an estimate what one might make in tips. There was a tip jar on the counter, so $16 an hour was pretty optimistic. Wow. And this is going on around Maine. I hear countless stories like this. Owen Higgins did a great piece about it, just looking at the nationwide story of just a lot of these employers doing this bait and switch. The other thing that I've heard from people who work at Walmart and some fast food restaurants is that they're crying that we're always hiring, but they're not looking at the applications that are coming in. So a woman at Walmart was telling me that they're very short-staffed, they're overworked, and she was asking her manager, like, you have all these signs that say we're hiring, yet you have a huge stack of applications on your desk. And he's like, yeah, I'm not really looking at those because, some of these companies have figured out how to squeeze more profits out of the workers during the pandemic. So they've seen opportunity in the fact that there's this quote unquote job labor shortage, and they're just squeezing more money out of their workers. So it's important to look underneath the hood when we're talking about this great resignation, because there's also plenty of people out there that are looking for gainful employment that'll pay their bills and pay the astronomical cost of housing and healthcare and everything else, and really struggling to find something that will meet their basic necessities.
Well, and in some ways, I wonder if we're just in a stage of catch up, right? When we see that profits have gone up so much over the last 50 years, we've all seen it. Minimum wage has stayed the same. Now, in Maine, we've done a little bit better, but nationally, minimum wage has stayed at $7.25 an hour, and so it's like there at some point there's got to be a catch up. And then somebody else said to me the other day, well, those jobs are meant to be for teenagers. Those are for teenagers. And I said, well, have you looked at the demographics? Because there actually aren't enough teenagers to do all those jobs. So
yeah. I mean, that's just such a trope that's been dragged out for the past 30, 40, 50 years, that people that are doing these jobs are teenagers. And it's just not the case. These are low-income people. A lot of women and people of color particularly work a lot of these low-wage jobs. I think that we are seeing some wages go up. I read a recent report in the Maine Center for Economic Policy that says that hospitality hourly wages have rose from about $17 an hour to about $20 an hour. This is in 2 years. So it is happening. And one of the things I always try to do when I'm talking to our members and union members who are working in various trades and stuff, where they'll say, well, why do those people deserve $15, $16, $17 for flipping burgers when I'm earning this much or whatever? And I always say, like, that's bringing you a tight labor market, and wages rising are giving you more leverage. This is actually very good news for you, because when you go into bargaining, you can say, look, this is what all these other occupations are getting paid. I deserve to get paid more. And union members are doing that, as we just talked about. And so at the same time, it's important to remind workers who aren't organized that they deserve to get paid more. Right. If they're not making enough to get by. And so, we've got on our website, if you want to form a union, we can hook you up with an organizer and tell you what it entails to start a union, because everybody deserves rights at work and the right to collectively bargain.
Yeah. Well, that is a perfect place for us to stop, Andy. And this is a time when it seems like there should be a, what did you call it? For Thanksgiving, Strikesgiving, right? So this is a time, I think, for workers to assert their rights and demand what we need from our job, because there's a great equalization that has to happen. So thank you so much for being with us, and thanks for all the work that you do all the time, Andy. You're awesome.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. All righty. So I want to talk today about work, and particularly about women's work. And that's why I'm coming to you from my messy kitchen, because that's where I spend a lot of my time, as do many, many, many women. So this pandemic has affected women and people of color very differently than it's affected men. 13 million fewer women are in the workforce now than were in the workforce before the pandemic. 25,000 women in Maine alone can't go back to work because they don't have adequate childcare. And have you noticed, like, the schools call and say, oh, school's out. Everyone's got to quarantine for 10 days. Yeah, we'll be closed. Your kid's classroom's going to be closed for the next 10 days, right? And if we have a job, what are we supposed to do? We don't have paid leave. We don't have flex time by and large. We don't have wages that pay enough that we can take unpaid leave, right? So what are we supposed to do? So it just kills me that the people who depend on women's work for the economy, a lot of low wage work, a lot of minimum wage, people who serve us in restaurants, people who depend on that, are the very same people that say you can't have paid leave, right? You can't have flexible work time. You can't have minimum wage. You tipped workers, you're doing just fine. Don't worry about it. So what if there's no customers today and you made $2 an hour? That's okay. Or if there's something wrong with your kid, you better drop everything and run up and get your kid, right? Those people who say that about us are also the very same people who are saying women shouldn't have reproductive choice. We shouldn't be our decision whether or not to have an abortion, whether or not to carry children to term, whether or not to have these children and raise them. So, right, the economy and your politics are on our backs, and we're sick of it. And we're not going to take it anymore. And if there's any silver lining in this worker shortage and all those signs that say help wanted, it's going to be us rising up and demanding what we need as workers, as BIPOC workers, as women of color, because it has been arranged around the schedule and the thought process of white men who don't have to worry about this for far too long. And it's about to change.